There was a time when gardens were not decorative. They were not weekend projects. They were not raised beds built for symmetry. They were not photographed. They were planted because food mattered. Before gardening became a hobby, it was a necessity. And that difference shaped everything, from how soil was prepared to what was planted, how much space was used, and what success actually meant. In the 1970s and 1980s, backyard gardens across Europe and North America were larger than most people remember. Not because families had more free time, but because they needed more food. A garden wasn't a patch, it was a section of land. Potatoes had rows, cabbage had rows. Beans climbed long wooden supports, carrots filled entire beds. The goal wasn't variety, it was volume. Today, many gardens are designed for diversity, a little lettuce, a few tomatoes, some herbs. Back then, staple crops dominated, the crops that stored, the crops that fed families for months. And soil wasn't something you bought in bags, it was something you built over years. Every autumn, beds were cleared but not abandoned. Leaves were added, manure was aged, compost piles grew steadily. Ash from wood stoves was saved and returned to the earth. Nothing was wasted. There were no quick fixes because quick fixes weren't available. Fertilizers existed, yes, but they were expensive, and many households preferred organic inputs simply because they were free and reliable. The system was closed loop. Kitchen scraps returned to soil. Garden waste became next season's fertility. That kind of consistency builds depth in soil. Modern gardening often starts in spring. Back then, preparation started the moment harvest ended. Rotation was not an advanced concept. It was common sense. You didn't plant potatoes in the same spot 2 years in a row. You moved them. You shifted crops across the yard so the soil could recover naturally. There were no laminated rotation charts on garden shed walls, just memory. Pests appeared. Affected plants were pests appeared. Affected plants were removed quickly. The relationship was direct. Today, gardening advice often comes from screens. Back then, it came from neighbors. Knowledge moved fence to fence. If someone had a better harvest, others asked why. Adjustments were gradual, seasonal, practical. Spacing was generous. Plants were not crammed together for aesthetic fullness. They were given room to grow properly. Crowding reduced yield, and yield mattered. Watering was deliberate. Without automated systems, watering required effort. That meant deep soaking rather than frequent shallow sprinkles. Roots grew deeper because they had to. Tools were simple: hose, forks, wooden stakes, twine. There were no battery-powered cultivators humming in the background. Labor was manual, and because labor was invested, planning was careful. Gardens were weeded regularly, not obsessively, but consistently. Weeds were removed before they competed heavily. Soil surfaces were loosened lightly with a hoe to improve air exchange. These small habits, repeated over years, created stable productivity. Another difference was expectation. Success wasn't measured by how pretty the garden looked in July. It was measured by how full the cellar was in October. Potatoes stored in wooden crates, cabbage fermented in barrels, onions braided and hung, beans dried and jarred. A garden's value was determined in winter. That mindset changes everything. When gardening becomes a hobby, it often becomes seasonal. When it is tied to survival or real food supply, it becomes systematic. People selected seeds carefully. They saved from their best plants. Over time, their varieties adapted to local soil and climate. Seed saving wasn't trendy. It was practical insurance. Modern convenience has made gardening easier in some ways. Raised beds, pre-mixed soils, drip irrigation systems, instant fertilizers. There's nothing wrong with these tools. But something subtle shifted. Gardening moved from food security to lifestyle activity. And when that shift happened, priorities changed. Efficiency replaced resilience. Appearance replaced storage weight. Convenience replaced preparation. What they did differently before gardening became a hobby wasn't complicated. They treated it seriously, not romantically, not decoratively, but practically. Scale shaped everything. Before gardening became a hobby, people didn't dedicate a single raised bed to tomatoes and call it a season. They allocated real ground. Entire sections of yard were turned over for food production. In many suburban neighborhoods of the 1970s and 1980s, backyard lawns were smaller than vegetable plots. Not because people were obsessed with gardening, because buying all your vegetables year-round was expensive. A serious garden meant serious planning. Potatoes weren't planted in neat decorative squares. They were planted in long rows measured by footsteps. Beans weren't a trellis feature. They were a protein source. Cabbage wasn't ornamental. It was winter food that would ferment into barrels and feed a family for months. The difference wasn't technique alone. It was purpose. When your goal is to produce enough food to matter, you choose crops differently. Fast-growing, short-lived vegetables take second place to dense, calorie-rich staples. You select varieties that store well, not ones that ripen quickly for Instagram-worthy salads. Late-season potatoes, storage onions, dry beans, winter squash, hardy cabbage. You plant for the cold months while you're still in spring. And because that was the goal, plants were allowed to mature fully. Harvest wasn't rushed, because early harvesting reduces storage quality. Tubers, roots, and heads were left in the soil until they reached full size. Vines were allowed to die naturally. Skins thickened. Sugars converted to starch. Flavor deepened. Modern gardening often celebrates early harvest. Back then, maturity was success. There was also less reliance on constant input. Today, if growth slows, many gardeners add fertilizer. If leaves pale, they search for a product. If pests appear, they reach for a spray. In the 1980s, adjustments were slower and simpler. Soil was improved over seasons, not corrected weekly. Compost was layered consistently. Manure was aged properly before use. Rotation reduced disease pressure without chemicals. Ash balanced potassium. Legumes replenished nitrogen naturally. The system was steady. That steadiness created resilience. Backyard gardens from that era were less optimized for speed, but more optimized for long-term stability. Soil fertility increased over time instead of fluctuating with every product application. And because gardens were larger, crop rotation was easier. You could move potatoes across the yard, follow them with beans, then cabbage, then roots. This reduced disease buildup and nutrient depletion naturally. Small decorative beds make rotation harder. Scale gave flexibility. Another quiet difference was tolerance. Plants weren't expected to look perfect. A few insect holes in cabbage leaves didn't mean failure. Slight leaf damage didn't trigger panic. As long as yield remained strong, the crop was considered successful. Today's gardening culture often emphasizes pristine visuals. Back then, weight mattered more than appearance. Community also reinforced standards. If one household harvested heavy yields year after year, others noticed. Methods spread through conversation. Advice was practical and local. Soil types differed street by street, and techniques adjusted accordingly. There were fewer universal rules, more observation, and perhaps most importantly, gardening was tied to rhythm. Spring preparation, summer maintenance, autumn harvest and preservation, winter storage and planning. It was cyclical and predictable. When gardening becomes a hobby, it often becomes seasonal entertainment. When it is tied to food security, it becomes integrated into life. The result wasn't perfection, but it was dependable. Gardens fed families not because they were beautiful, but because they were systematic. And that system, built quietly over years, is what many people remember when they say, vegetables used to taste better, yields used to be bigger, and gardens used to work differently. Gardening didn't become worse, it became lighter, easier, cleaner, more accessible, but also more optional. Before it was a hobby, a garden carried weight. Not emotional weight, practical weight. The kind that filled shelves in a cellar. The kind that determined how often you went to the store in January. The kind that made you pay attention to soil in October, even when harvest was already done. What they did differently wasn't dramatic. They planned backward from winter. They asked, will this feed us in February? Not, will this look good in July? They built soil continuously, not reactively. They planted with space, not density for appearance. They chose varieties for storage, not novelty. They harvested at maturity, not convenience. They rotated because depletion was visible, and they accepted that effort was part of the equation. There were no shortcuts, because shortcuts usually reduced yield. When gardening becomes a hobby, the stakes are lower. If tomatoes fail, you buy tomatoes. If potatoes are small, it's disappointing, but not serious. So methods soften. Timing becomes flexible. Preparation shortens. The biology of plants hasn't changed, but urgency has. The older system worked not because people knew more science, but because they observed consequences directly. A weak harvest meant adjustment. A strong harvest meant continuation. It was feedback, not theory. And that feedback loop created consistency. If you look closely at what made those gardens productive, you'll notice something quiet. Nothing relied on constant correction. The soil improved slowly. Seeds adapted locally. Rotation prevented buildup. Storage shaped planting choices. It was less reactive, more seasonal, more deliberate. And perhaps that's the real difference. When gardening was tied to food security, it demanded structure. When it became a hobby, it became expressive. There's nothing wrong with expressive gardening. It brings beauty, relaxation, creativity. But if your goal is yield, if you want heavy potatoes, dense carrots, cabbage that lasts through winter, the older mindset still applies. Build soil long before you plant. Plant with space and purpose. Let crops reach full maturity. Think about storage when you choose seeds. Plan rotation before you sow the first row. Not because it's nostalgic, but because it aligns with how plants actually grow best. Some practices fade because convenience replaces necessity, yet the principles remain. Gardening only became a hobby when it stopped being essential. And the moment you treat it as essential again, even in a small backyard, you begin to see why those old gardens worked so reliably. Not because they were old, but because they were intentional.